Let's go! Welcome to the channel where things get exciting, fun, and a little unpredictable. I'm here to bring you content that keeps you entertained and coming back for more. Smash that subscribe button and join the ride. You don't want to miss this.
The night everything fell apart, I was standing in the driveway holding a bag of Chinese takeout, still warm, and I remember thinking that the porch light was off. She always left the porch light on. I'd been married to my wife for 11 years. We met when I was 26, working a mid-level project management job for a commercial contractor in Cincinnati. She was a dental hygienist. Pretty. Practical. The kind of woman who alphabetized the spice rack and remembered everyone's birthday. We had 2 kids, a boy named Brett, 13 at the time, and a girl named Lena, 9. We had a house with a 2-car garage in a neighborhood where people still waved at each other. I thought we were fine. I genuinely thought we were fine. I knocked on the door of my own house like an idiot because my hands were full, and when she opened it, she looked at me like she'd been caught doing something. Not guilty exactly. More like inconvenienced. And there was a smell. Something chemical. Sweet but wrong. I found out 3 weeks later what that smell was. But let me back up. Her name was Sherry. I'll call her that because that's her name and I'm done protecting it. Sherry had started working a second job about 8 months before that night. Or so she told me. She said it was at a medical billing company, remote work, just 10 hours a week to help with the credit card debt we'd accumulated after Brett's orthodontics and Lena's broken arm that summer. I didn't question it. I was traveling 2 weeks out of every month for work. I was tired. I trusted her. The second job didn't exist. I found that out from her sister, Pam, who called me 6 months later and apologized in advance for what she was about to tell me. Pam said Sherry had been spending her evenings with a man named Fletcher, mid-30s, unemployed, lived in an apartment complex off Route 32 that had a broken front gate and a parking lot that smelled like old fast food. She said Sherry had been driving over there 2-3 times a week. She said she'd seen them together twice and told Sherry to stop, and Sherry told her to mind her own business. I sat in my truck in the parking lot of a Home Depot for 45 minutes after that phone call. I didn't cry. I just sat there. At some point, a cart wrangler knocked on my window to ask if I was all right, and I told him I was fine and drove home. I didn't confront Sherry that night. I waited. I don't know why. Part of me needed to confirm it myself. Part of me was terrified of what confirmation would mean for my kids. I started paying attention to the small things I'd stopped noticing. The late texts she deleted, the new habit of taking her phone to the bathroom, the way she'd stopped touching me entirely. Like I was furniture she'd gotten used to working around. I hired a private investigator for 2 weeks. Cost me $900. He handed me a manila envelope in the parking lot of a Panera Bread, and I told him thank you, and I meant it. I waited until the kids were at my mother's the following Saturday. I put the envelope on the kitchen table. I sat across from it. When Sherry came downstairs in her robe and saw my face, she knew immediately. She didn't even look at the envelope. She sat down and said, "How long have you known?" That question, that's the one that got me. Not "I'm sorry," not "let me explain." How long have you known? Like it was my failing for finding out. I told her I wanted her out of the house by the end of the week. I told her I'd talk to my lawyer Monday morning. She cried. She said she'd ended it, that it was a mistake, that she loved our family. I believe 0% of that because I'm not 22 anymore, and I know what a person looks like when they're sorry versus when they're sorry they got caught. I walked upstairs, locked the bedroom door, and called my mom to ask if she could keep the kids an extra night. She left on Tuesday. What I didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that Sherry was already pregnant. I found that out 4 months later through Brett. He called me after school on Wednesday, which was unusual because Brett almost never called. He texted like all teenagers. When his name came up on my phone as a call, I pulled over immediately thinking something was wrong. Something was wrong. He said, "Dad, Mom told me something, and I don't know what to do with it." I told him to take his time. He said, "She's having a baby. She says it's not yours." She says the guy, Fletcher. She says he's in a hospital. I asked what kind of hospital. He was quiet for a second. "The kind for drugs, I think." I gripped my steering wheel. "Okay," I said. "Okay, where are you right now?" "In the parking lot of the gas station on Maple. I told Mom I was going to get a snack." He paused. "Dad, she's showing." "Like, visibly. How long was this?" He stopped himself. He was 13. He was doing math he shouldn't have had to do. How long did you know? I found out she'd been seeing him about 6 months ago, I said. I didn't know about this. He made a sound I'll never forget. Not crying exactly. Something smaller and more careful than crying. Like the sound of a kid absorbing a fact they'll carry for the rest of their life. I drove to my lawyer's office the next morning without an appointment and waited 90 minutes in a lobby. When I finally got in, I told him everything. He asked if I wanted to expedite the divorce filing. I said yes. He asked if I wanted to pursue full custody given the circumstances. I said yes. My name was not on anything related to the pregnancy. That was made clear immediately. Paternity was never a question. The timeline alone ruled me out completely. Fletcher, whoever he was, had apparently been told about the pregnancy before his current situation and had reacted by disappearing further into whatever hole he was already in. Sherry was living with her mother, working part-time, stress eating. Pam told me all of this. I stopped asking Pam to tell me things because it stopped helping. Lena didn't understand the full picture yet. I sat with her one Sunday and explained, as carefully as a father can, that Mom and Dad were going to be living separately from now on, and that Mom was going to have a new baby. Lena blinked at me. She was 9. She said, "Is the baby going to be my brother or sister?" I said, "That's a good question, Bug." She thought about it and said, "I want a sister. I already have Brett. Kids. They find the detail that matters to them and they hold on to it." 6 months went by. The divorce moved forward. I got the house. Sherry got an arrangement that gave her weekends and summers with the kids pending the final judgment. I was civil. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't angry in private, but in front of my children and in every legal proceeding, I was civil. My lawyer said it was the smartest thing I could do and he was right, but honestly, it was also just, I didn't have the energy for anything else. I was working full-time, parenting most of the week, grocery shopping, doing laundry, helping with homework. I was running on 4 hours of sleep and gas station coffee. There was no room for rage. Then the baby was born. A boy, healthy, 5 weeks early, which terrified everyone, but he caught up fast. Sherry named him Theo. Fletcher was released from his facility, inpatient rehab. I eventually learned for fentanyl approximately 2 months before Theo was born. He lasted maybe 6 weeks before he relapsed. I know this not because I was tracking him, but because Sherry's mother, a woman named Eunice, who had never once concealed her opinions about anything in her life, called me personally to inform me that her daughter was dealing with a great deal, and she hoped I would consider the bigger picture. I thanked her politely and got off the phone. I didn't hear anything else for a while. Then Sherry went into the hospital. She collapsed at work. Eunice called me because I was still listed somewhere as an emergency contact and nobody had thought to change it. She said Sherry was being evaluated. She said she thought it was exhaustion and dehydration, but she said it with the careful phrasing of someone who suspected it was something else. 3 days later, it was confirmed. Sherry had relapsed herself. She'd been using. Apparently not for long, but long enough. Child Protective Services was involved immediately because Theo was only 4 months old. Eunice had a bad hip and couldn't take the baby full-time. Fletcher was gone. No one could locate him. Sherry entered a residential treatment program that would keep her for a minimum of 90 days. Theo went to a temporary foster arrangement. I found all of this out on a Thursday night when Brett came into the living room while I was watching the news and sat down next to me and said nothing for a full minute. I turned the TV off. I waited. He said, "Dad, I need to ask you something and I need you to actually think about it before you answer." I said, "Okay." "Theo is in foster care. I know you know that. Mom's in a program. I know you know that too." He looked at the coffee table. "He's 4 months old. He doesn't have anybody." I said, "Brett." "I know," he said immediately. "I know what I'm asking. I know what it means. I'm not asking you to love him. I'm just asking if you would consider taking him. Temporarily. Until Mom gets out." I stared at my son. My 13-year-old son was sitting in my living room asking me to temporarily foster his mother's baby. A baby who was the direct product of the affair that had broken our family in half. He was not asking out of naivety. He understood exactly what this was. His voice didn't even wobble. I said, "Can I ask you something first?" He nodded. "Why does this matter to you so much?" He thought about it for a moment. Really thought. Then he said, "Because Lena already asked about him twice this week, and because he didn't do anything." I didn't say anything for a long time. I walked into the kitchen. I poured a glass of water. I stood at the sink and looked at the backyard in the dark. And I thought about the version of myself at 13. what I knew about fairness at that age, what I understood about innocence, what I would have done if someone had asked me to be better than my circumstances. I thought about the envelope in the Panera parking lot and the porch light that was off, and the Chinese food I'd eaten alone that night sitting on the floor of the garage because I couldn't make myself go back inside. And then I thought about a 4-month-old baby in a foster placement who didn't know any of that, who had not chosen any of that. I called my attorney the next morning. Not to take custody, that wasn't what anyone was asking, and legally it wasn't mine to offer. But I called him to ask what a temporary kinship care arrangement might look like, given my relationship to Brett and Lena, who were Theo's half-siblings. He said it was an unconventional ask, but not an impossible one. He said CPS would evaluate the home environment. He said I'd need to be formally assessed. He said it would require Sherry's written consent from the treatment facility. I asked him to look into it. She said, James. She's the only person who ever calls me that. Everyone else calls me by my last name out of some habit I've never been able to shake. She said, James, you have a good heart, and that's not always a convenient thing to have. I said, is that a yes or a no? She said, I'll be there Saturday. You're going to need a crib. The evaluation took 3 weeks. A caseworker named Margaret came to the house twice. She talked to Brett and Lena separately without me in the room. She reviewed my finances, my employment history, my living situation. She spoke with my mother. At one point, she asked me very directly how I felt about Sherry and whether I believed I could care for this child without projecting that onto him. I told her the truth. I told her I was still angry. I told her that anger was mine to manage and not Theo's to absorb. I told her that my kids already loved this little boy and that I refused to let my feelings become their loss. She wrote something on her notepad. She didn't tell me what. Sherry signed the consent from the treatment facility. I don't know what that cost her emotionally. I didn't ask. It wasn't my business. Theo came home on a Friday afternoon. He was almost 5 months old. He was small and had more hair than you'd expect, and he looked at the ceiling fan in the living room like it was the most extraordinary thing he'd ever encountered in his short life. Lena immediately sat on the floor next to him and started narrating the room to him in a voice I'd never heard her use before. Brett stood in the doorway and watched for a minute, and then went to his room and came back with a stuffed dog he'd had since he was 4 and put it in the corner of the crib without explanation. I stood in the kitchen and watched all of this happen. My mother squeezed my arm and went back to the stove where she'd been making soup. It was a lot of things at once. I'm not going to clean it up and make it simple. Some mornings I woke up at 2 a.m. to Theo crying, and I lay there for a second before getting up, and I won't pretend there weren't moments of bitterness. Not toward him. Never toward him, but toward the wreckage he derived from. I'd be lying if I said those moments didn't happen. They happened. Then I'd pick him up and he'd stop crying and grab my finger with his whole fist, and I'd stand in the dark nursery at 2 in the morning and think, okay. My attorney told me around the 8-week mark that Fletcher had surfaced. He was in a county in West Virginia living with relatives. He had been informed of Theo's existence through a legal intermediary. He had made no move to seek any kind of custody or parental rights. My attorney said this was actually the simplest possible outcome from a legal standpoint. No, not from any other standpoint. I asked what no move meant in practical terms. He said it meant we wait. We waited. Sherry completed her 90 days and then voluntarily extended to a 6-month program. I respected that. Whatever my feelings about everything else, that was hard. That takes something real. She called Brett every Sunday from the facility, and the calls were short, and she always asked about Theo at the end. Brett always told her Theo was fine. One time Lena got on the phone and told her that Theo had learned to roll over, and I heard Sherry start crying on the other end. And Lena didn't know what to do, so she just kept describing it. He did it like 3 times, Mom. He got really mad the first time. Some things break your heart and reconstruct it at the same time. I don't have a better way to say it. 6 months and 12 days after Theo came to live with us, I sat across from my attorney in his office and we talked about what comes next. Sherry was completing her program in 3 weeks. She wanted to reestablish a parenting relationship with her kids and eventually with Theo. The question was what my role would be going forward. I told him I didn't want to be Theo's father. That wasn't what this was. I had stepped into a gap because there was a gap, and because 2 kids I loved had needed me too, and because a baby who had no say in anything needed somewhere stable to land. But I told him I also wasn't interested in Theo being moved around like luggage. Whatever arrangement came next needed to be consistent. We drafted a proposal. Sherry's attorney reviewed it. After 2 long weeks of back and forth, we arrived at something. Sherry would resume custody as she demonstrated stability, with a structured reintegration schedule. I would be listed as a secondary placement of preference if she ever needed emergency support. Brett and Lena would have regular, defined time with Theo regardless of custody arrangements. It wasn't a legal document anybody had a template for. My attorney said it 3 times. This is not standard. But he filed it and both parties signed, and the judge, a woman who looked like she'd seen genuinely everything in her decades on the bench, read the whole thing carefully, looked up, and said, "I appreciate when adults find a way to act like adults." Sherry came to pick Theo up on a Sunday. She looked better than she had. Steadier. She sat in my living room, the house I got in the divorce, and held Theo for a long time without saying anything. Lena sat next to her and told her what his favorite songs were. Brett shook her hand when she arrived, which struck me as an incredibly Brett thing to do. I stood near the door. I wasn't going to pretend it wasn't strange. It was strange. But it was also just life. Untidy, unresolved, moving forward anyway. When she left with Theo in the car seat, Lena cried a little. Brett put his arm around her in the doorway. I watched them from behind and thought about how neither of them had asked for any of this, and how both of them had handled it with more grace than most adults I knew. I took them out for pizza that night. We didn't talk about any of it. We talked about Brett's baseball tryouts and a YouTube video Lena was obsessed with, and whether pineapple belonged on pizza, which is a debate in this house that will apparently never be resolved. The porch light was on when we got home. I noticed that. I don't know why I noticed it, but I didn't know. I don't know how this story ends. Theo is 8 months old now. Sherry has been sober for 7 months, and I hope she stays that way. Genuinely, because if she doesn't, the one who will feel it most is a little boy who deserves better than the start he got. Fletcher is still somewhere in West Virginia. My divorce was finalized 43 days ago. I am 41 years old, and I wake up most mornings and make coffee and pack lunches and drive Brett to baseball, and help Lena with her reading assignments and try to be the kind of man my kids can point to later and say, yeah, that's where I learned what to do when things go wrong. You do what you can with what's in front of you. That's the whole thing, really. That's all of it. I've thought a lot about what made this whole thing move the way it did. Not just Sherry's choices, not just mine, the whole sequence of it. Because nothing happened in isolation. Every decision, including the ones made in the dark and the ones made out of desperation, sent something forward. That's not a philosophy I learned anywhere. It's just what I watched happen in real time, in my own house, over the course of about 2 years. Sherry made choices that cost her everything she said she valued. I don't say that with satisfaction. I say it because it's just true, and ignoring it doesn't help anyone. She had a family that worked. Maybe it wasn't electric, maybe we'd gotten comfortable in ways that left gaps, but it worked, and she traded it for something that gave her nothing back except a situation she wasn't equipped to handle alone. The consequences weren't punishment from anywhere outside herself. They came directly from the choices, one after another, like links in a chain she'd been building without looking at it. And me? I made choices too. I could have stayed bitter. I had full justification. Nobody would have blamed me for closing the door on anything connected to that part of my life, but I kept coming back to Brett's face in that parking lot, doing math he shouldn't have had to do. I kept coming back to Lena asking if the baby was going to be a sister. Those 2 kids didn't pick their circumstances any more than Theo did. And if I let my anger become the deciding factor in how I moved forward, I wasn't just punishing Sherry. I was shaping what Brett and Lena learned about what a person does when the world hands them something unfair. That's the part that got me. Not duty, not obligation in some abstract sense. Just the very plain fact that my kids were watching. They were learning from me what resilience actually looks like. Not the motivational poster version. The real version, which is mostly just getting up and doing the next right thing even when you're tired and angry, and the situation is genuinely not your fault. Brett showed me something that night on the couch that I don't think I could have shown him. He was 13, and he already understood that innocence is its own kind of claim on us. Theo hadn't done anything. That was the whole argument, and it was enough. I think about the kind of man Brett is going to be someday, and I'm not worried about him. He already has the thing that matters most. He can look past his own pain and still see clearly. I'm not holding myself up as an example of anything. I lost sleep. I had moments of real bitterness that I'm not proud of. I stood at that kitchen sink more than once and had to talk myself back from a version of myself I didn't want to be. But I kept making the next small decision in the right direction, and the small decisions added up. Theo is healthy. Sherry is sober. My kids are okay. The porch light is on. That's enough.